cue dramatic music, it'll sound more like propaganda. Cue dramatic music. Serious allegations have been made by the American State Department that there is currently a cultural genocide taking place in Xinjiang, China, to the Uyghur people. Allegedly, the Chinese government has incarcerated around 1 million Uyghur Muslims in what many have claimed to be re-education camps. Real ones, and they have nothing to do with the satirical name of this show. Of course, the Chinese government has denied all of these allegations, insisting that what is happening to the Uyghur Muslims is nothing more than de-radicalization education. What is happening is despicable, it is disgusting, but unfortunately it is being used by both China and the United States to push a lot of propaganda. There is all kinds of misinformation coming out on both sides, and today we're going to do a deep dive into all of it. This is going to be a bit of a long episode, but I think it's important, and there are a number of twists and turns along the way, and I assure you at the end of this video, you're going to find out some information that you had no idea even existed up until now. Both the United States and the Chinese government are using this issue to push their own narratives, and today we're going to push back. Hi, my name is Aaron, this is my show Re-Education, and today we're going to be talking about the alleged genocide of the Uyghur people. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Now, before we get started with any of this, I just want to say that social media inherently incentivizes a lot of us to form opinions on a lot of these topics before we actually have the full information on those topics to really have an informed opinion. And I don't believe that that's a real way to do journalism or science or make any kind of real progress at all. So what we're going to do today is we're going to follow the evidence so we can come to a conclusion at the end. Obviously, I have my opinion because I've done a bunch of research on this, but you have to understand that that is only my opinion. You might come to a different opinion, and if you do, then please leave a comment in the comment section down below. As one of my commenters said, follow the evidence, never lead the evidence. So to truly understand what's going on in Xinjiang, China with the Uyghur people, we're going to use something known as materialist dialectics, or at least a very basic version thereof. And for those of you who don't know what that is, essentially we're going to be taking an argument from one side and an argument from the other side, putting them against each other and seeing which one comes on top. Or to put that in fancy pants terms, you have the thesis, the antithesis or antithesis, and the synthesis, what the result of that is, or negation, if you follow dialectical materialism. So let's start with the American government side of the story. Recently, the American State Department has come out and saying that what is happening to the Uyghur people is a genocide. There have been several United States officials, as well as many mainstream media news outlets in America, that have been pushing this specific narrative, as well as a number of news outlets in Canada, Australia, and across Europe. Now, I'm going to show you some of these clips, and for the full context, I'm going to ask that you check out all of the links in the description box below. With all of that being said, let's show some of these clips.
Fox News alert now, the United States leveling perhaps the most serious charge a country can face, accusing China in the last hour and a bit of committing genocide and crimes against humanity in its repression of Uyghur Muslims. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo made the announcement just a short time ago. He joins us now for an exclusive interview. Mr. Secretary, good to have you with us. Let me just read, if I could, from your statement. You said, quote, "I have determined that the People's Republic of China, under the direction and control of the Chinese Communist Party, has committed genocide and crimes against the predominantly Muslim Uyghurs and other ethnic and religious minority groups." A very significant declaration, obviously one that China will oppose vigorously, but also one that sort of runs counter to what President Trump's position has been for the last couple of years.
Well, John, thanks for having me on. This is a very serious and tragic set of actions that are taking place there. This is forced labor, this is forced sterilizations, forced abortions. John, the kind of things that we haven't seen in an awfully long time.
Mr. Secretary, since you made the announcement a little more than an hour ago, it has received a tremendous amount of approval in the United States Congress, particularly from your Republican colleagues. This was something that then candidate Joe Biden proclaimed about a year ago. Now, obviously, when you're a candidate, it's much easier to say something than when you are the State Department. But some of your Republican colleagues, Ben Sasse notably, are saying, what took so long?
Look, I'm happy to accept that critique. What took so long is when you do something like this, you have to be right. You have to, and I think this will be a bipartisan analysis that will be shared by a broad swath of American leadership. Indeed, leaders all across the world, I think, will recognize that the United States got this right.
We're in Xinjiang, a place unlike anywhere on Earth. It's home to the Uyghurs, a mostly Muslim minority who've lived here for centuries. Xinjiang has long been a pressure point where China's ethnic tensions have played out. But in the last decade, a handful of violent incidents have disturbed the region.
It's been 3 days since bloody riots broke out, pitting ethnic Uyghur Muslims against the dominant Han Chinese.
China blames this unrest on Islamic extremism and ethnic separatism. Their response? To detain over 1 million people in massive new facilities, where they're taken for so-called re-education. The government has presented these as joyful training schools, where they're correcting extremist behavior. But the US Defense Department has called them concentration camps. We arrived in Kashgar. Surveillance cameras were everywhere. 100,000 new police officers have been hired across the region from 2016 to 2017 alone, and it shows. It was 12:30 a.m. when we walked back to the hotel. The streets were dead. Then we saw movement. So we're just watching as a bunch of policemen are marching 8 Uyghur men, young men, all the way down the street to the police station. We've just watched them for the last 4 minutes or so march in complete dead silence. It's really, really fucking chilling.
A new leak of classified Chinese government documents has exposed the secret details behind China's mass detention camps.
It's very, very important that these documents are from 2017, because that's when the whole re-education campaign started. And it really shows that from the onset, the Chinese government had a plan in how to secure the vocational training centers.
The classified documents include a lengthy memo that basically serves as a how-to manual on how to detain an ethnic minority population.
Religious extremism and terrorism are closely linked with each other. Despite the difficulty in solving the issue, training centers are expected to find the answer.
These documents are really sort of the operational mechanics of the large-scale activities going on in Xinjiang.
The documents also confirm many eyewitness accounts, including how doors must be double-locked, how there are guards and guard towers, and a very strict daily regimen. Guards were instructed to prevent escape, so-called abnormal deaths, and epidemics. There's also a section about how all camp personnel must maintain absolute secrecy about the camps.
These classified government documents, it's like one important piece of a puzzle, consistent with witness evidence. I think that's what makes it so significant.
Now, as you can see, a lot of these allegations are extremely damning. But at this point, we are still only talking relatively about allegations made by one side of the story. We now must take a look at the other side of the story so we can get a more full picture. Though, remember that both sides are trying to run their own narratives here, and both sides have a lot of reasons to attack one another, which we will talk about later on in this video.
Fresh and shocking footage of acts of terrorism in Xinjiang in the past 2 decades has been released in response to criticism of current prevention measures. The State Council Information Office of China has offered clear numbers to mark the progress made in Xinjiang and says that the U.S. is using double standards regarding anti-terrorism and eliminating extremism. On the topic of double standard, do you feel that the United States has been using a double standard in judging the situation in Xinjiang because China, as a victim of terrorism, feels that it has every right to take measures, good measures, preventative measures to keep people safe on its own territory. That's exactly what China feels it has been doing in Xinjiang.
I believe that the fight against terrorism in Xinjiang is a part of the fight against terrorism globally.
A pastoral life at the foot of the Tian Shan Mountains. It's known for its idyllic beauty. It's home to some 50 ethnic groups and diverse religions. This is Xinjiang, China's westernmost region. And it's also the frontier of China's fight against extremism and terrorism. The priority of the Chinese government is prevention. This includes the establishment of vocational education and training centers.
在那个地方，第一个我们就说3学1去，就是要给他学法律法规。首先，他要知道他自己的活动空间在哪里。第二个要学文化。 然后第三个要学国语，要56个民族全部要团结，紧密的团结。团结首先要沟通，就这些事情在那个地方3学，目的就是要去极端思想。
The authorities say the purpose is to curb attacks and to stamp out the breeding ground and spread of terrorism. Scrutiny by some Western countries has been constant. But according to the white paper, no terrorist incidents have occurred in Xinjiang for nearly 3 years since the education and training started.
So as far as the Chinese narrative goes, essentially what they are saying is that they want to create a system that opposes radical Islamic extremism. You remember that meme back from the early 2000s? Well, this is essentially China's way to deal with it. They say that a lot of these internment camps are just vocational centers where a lot of these Uyghur people are going so they can learn to be de-radicalized, essentially making them no longer want to be evil, violent terrorists that are just attacking people in China because they hate them for their freedom. Boy, that narrative doesn't sound familiar, does it? The Chinese government have completely denied all of the allegations made by the American and the Canadian governments, and we're going to show a little bit of their side of the story with these clips.
What's happening inside the so-called re-education camps in Xinjiang? Was that a campaign of religious repression or an unprecedented effort of de-radicalization? I don't have all the answers, but I want to find out. And we traveled across Xinjiang to track down some of the attendees in the program. We met 33-year-old artist Abdulzikari Albouli, who perfected his painting skills in the re-education center and now works in a gallery. We caught up with 30-year-old Yurugu Yusam, who works in hospitality. We found 26-year-old Rukia Yakub, who improved her Mandarin and now works as a real estate agent. And we met 23-year-old Halanur, who became a cashier at a restaurant. 54 countries, most of them Muslim-majority states, defended China's counter-extremism efforts in Xinjiang, commending China in its development policies there and in, quote-unquote, promoting care to its Muslim citizens. And they probably have a point. China has built at least 35,000 mosques, more than France's 2,300, America's 2,106, and Great Britain's 1,600. Even on a per capita basis, Chinese Muslims still have more than triple the amount of mosques their Western peers have. That said, there are real concerns too. Many reports said that the mosques here have been demolished on a large scale. Is that true?
Xinjiangda aztola mescid chiqilgan ishlarmi bor. Shu masjid nayto uzun tarixiga ko'nirib ketgan. Ham o'lib tushish xatarlik bo'lib qolganligi uchun biz chiqib uni boshqa yerga soldik. Har qanday vaqtida, har mahallada kishilar chirib bemalol namoz o'qib chiqa oladi.
So that's the Chinese government's narrative. But what's really going on here? Obviously, we've heard one side from an incredibly biased source, and then we've heard another side from another incredibly biased source. But what exactly is it that's happening? And how can we find out? Well, to first really understand what's going on, the best thing to do is to look back into the history and see exactly how we got to this point. If journalism is who, what, where, why. If journalism adheres to the who, what, when, where, why, how thing, then this would probably be the what and where part. Who, what, when, where, who, what, I don't know. I'm not a journalist. I'm just some guy in his living room. You should take everything I say and what every streamer and YouTuber and content creator say with a grain of salt. Because you have to always remember that we all have our own incentives, and some people's incentives might lead them to believe certain narratives more than others. So to really understand what's going on, we're going to have to look back in history a little bit, and for that we're going to look all the way back to the ancient year of 2001? Okay, fine. It sounds like prehistory as far as I'm concerned, but let's take a look and see exactly what was going on. Now, if you remember, back in the early 2000s, there was kind of this little bit of an event called 9/11, which basically set the world on fire for the next, well, it's still on fire, and basically changed pretty much how we view all Muslims across the entire world. Now, that narrative may have been going all across the West, but little known to everybody else, that narrative was also pushing its way into China. Up until the mid-2000s, China boasted that it didn't actually have any terrorist activity whatsoever.
In fact, in 2001, just 10 days before 9/11, the Chinese government itself said there was no terrorism in Xinjiang.
But then, all of a sudden, they started to notice an uptick of terrorist activity happening within their borders. Now, I'm going to show some footage of some very graphic images of some terrorist attacks that happened back in China during the early 2000s. So if you're squeamish about that sort of thing, please skip ahead to the timestamp below.
The police have reviewed more evidence about the 2009 riots in Urumqi. Experts say the factors in the violence are complicated and have left wounds in the different ethnic groups. This security video shows how machete-wielding terrorists from Xinjiang attacked commuters in southwest China's Yunnan province at the Kunming railway station in March 2014. They killed 31 people and wounded over 140. 5 terrorists rammed their vehicles into shoppers at the morning market in Xinjiang's regional capital, Urumqi, setting off explosives. They killed 39 people and wounded 94. 2014 saw a third attack in July in Yurkan County, causing multiple deaths and casualties. A truck driver hit his wife in the back seat. She was lucky and escaped. He did not.
On October 28, 2013, an SUV rammed through barricades in front of the gate tower and burst into flames. The attack killed 2 civilians and wounded over 40. The driver and the 2 passengers all died. The authorities soon declared the incident a terrorist attack. They said it was not an isolated incident outside Xinjiang.
Now, those are some incredibly graphic images. Absolutely disgusting and honestly, truly terrifying. But one thing that we have to remember is that this is only a tiny, tiny minority of the population of Muslims that exist within the entire world or within the Xinjiang province or in China in general. The vast, vast majority of Muslims across the entire world agree that these sort of activities are absolutely heinous and they do not condone them. They, in fact, often, all the time, condemn them. Even more so than most Christians condemn the actions of people that are doing violent acts in the name of Christianity, or white people when people are doing violent acts in the name of whiteness. And labeling an entire ethnic group for the actions of a very small number in that group is racism. And just like the United States was during that time, the Chinese government also used this propaganda to basically segregate and attack Muslims in general. Now, China has had for a very long time a bit of a race problem within its country. Now, all of these attacks ended up resulting in a riot in 2009 that left over 100 people dead and several more wounded. Buildings were set on fire, cars were set on fire, buses were pushed around. Many of the people that lost their lives were the Han Chinese people, apparently, and a lot of news sources covered this as essentially a race riot.
And relative calm has returned to the streets of Urumqi in western China, where ethnic riots left more than 150 dead and hundreds more injured. Bloomberg's Stephen McDonell is on top of that story. Steve.
Yeah, Haslinda, order has been restored to Urumqi. Most roads have been cleared and people are said to be staying off the streets this morning. The government now saying more than 1,400 people have been arrested as police quelled the violence over the last couple of days. The latest death toll, 156 dead, more than 800 injured. State television has aired plenty of footage of bodies, bloodied people, smoke billowing from overturned cars, and what you're seeing right here, this is footage from CCTV, which is the state media. Xinhua news agency also saying more than 200 of what the government called rioters were still trying to gather at an Urumqi mosque late last night, but were dispersed by police. Authorities blaming overseas Uyghur groups for this violence. Separatists have tried to split the largely Muslim region from China for years, and tension has flared in the past between the Uyghurs and the nation's ethnic Han majority, including in a recent factory brawl down in the southern province of Guangdong.
They don't know what's happened to all the men. The police just came, they tell us, and took them away during the night. Part of the over 1,000 Uyghurs arrested by Chinese authorities. We want them free. We want them free. Over and over again, they tell us this is all they want. This woman shows us her husband's identification card. She has no idea where he is. Its neighborhood clearly feeling the consequences of the rioting from Sunday night. And suddenly the sadness took a more aggressive and violent tone. Armed police with guns and electric cattle prods. Soldiers with shields and sticks, moving in to contain the chaos. These are complicated ethnic tensions, China's westernmost province populated by these Turkic Uyghurs. But it's the Han Chinese who run the government. Some Uyghurs are separatists, but others are angry over what they feel as their second-class treatment in this country. This man tells us riot police should have fired and killed more protesters. They were violent, he says. If the officers had used their weapons, fewer ordinary citizens would have died. It is very clear some people were hell-bent on destruction this weekend. We saw the remains of buildings and vehicles, and we could still smell the burnt plastic and metal.
All of the sources agree that at this point is when China really started ramping up its anti-terrorist activity, which resulted in many Uyghurs being detained and incarcerated, wrongfully profiled just for the way that they look or the clothes that they're wearing, and also resulted in 2017 a bunch of apparently large camps that are re-education camps or vocational centers, apparently, according to China, where a lot of these Uyghur people were being shipped off to. According to several sources, thousands of people within the Uyghur community have been shipped off into these camps, and some numbers even put this up towards over 1 million. There has been a massive increase in policing of the Uyghur people, and the entire area is under incredible amounts of surveillance. Many reports are even saying that there are just random checks where police will take your phone away, check the pictures that you have on it, and go ahead and just delete stuff. Now, this doesn't only involve police officers looking through phones. Apparently, it also involved many plainclothes police officers that essentially use intimidation tactics to try to stop certain individuals from recording or producing any information that could be damaging to the Chinese government, and essentially trying to stop any documentation from being released from there, as you can see from the report from Australia in the link in the description box below.
Sure enough, next morning, when we try to leave and film, there's a welcoming committee on hand. No need for a taxi, we're told, because our official friends will take us.
那为什么要用你的车？
因为我们要陪着你，保护你。
为什么？
保护你，陪着你。
为什么？
你是外宾。
什么意思？你担心什么？
They say we're in breach of procedures for not having formally applied to conduct interviews here.
如果我们走路，我认识一个人，就是老百姓，我想采访他们，他们介绍，他们同意介绍采访，这个有什么问题吗？
他们不同意采访。
And there's security everywhere. In just one morning, various authorities stopped Al Jazeera's team 7 times. We could not escape the police presence. The security has clearly come at a price. You wonder if this is any way to live. But for now, the soldiers march on.
Now, the majority of the damning evidence that's coming out against China on this comes from a few different sources, and it primarily has to do with 3 different things. Parts of the Canadian government and the American State Department declaring this a genocide, the China cables, and a lot of evidence that was reported from a, let's say, less than reliable source. Adrian Zens.
It's very, very important that these documents are from 2017. Because that's when the whole re-education campaign started. And it really shows that from the onset, the Chinese government had a plan in how to secure the vocational training centers. These classified government documents, it's like one important piece of a puzzle, consistent with witness evidence. I think that's what makes it so significant.
Now, we'll talk about all of the other things as well further on in this video, but first, we gotta talk about Zens because... oh boy. Now, according to Google, Adrian Zens is a German anthropologist known for his studies of the Xinjiang internment camps and the Uyghur genocide. He is also a senior fellow of China Studies at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and has authored at least 1 book. That book, of course, being Worthy to Escape: Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation. In that book, he essentially states that Satan thinks that gender equality is an attack on good Christian folks, with quotes that go a little something like this. Through notions of gender equality, the enemy is undermining God's unique but different role assignments for men and women. And also, another important God-giving authority structure that Satan is attacking through the postmodern spirit is that of gender authority structures. Like I said, Zens is also employed at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, which just so happens to be an organization that believes all of the victims of COVID-19 are in fact victims of communism. And he also works for the Jamestown Foundation, a neoconservative think tank in Washington, D.C., founded as the outcome of efforts by Ronald Reagan's CIA director, William J. Casey, to establish an extra-governmental channel to pay Soviet dissidents. And yes, this is real life. I don't think that I have to tell you that Adrian Zens is basically one of the most unreliable sources that you could possibly use for anything ever, and borderlines Alex Jones level conspiracy theories nearly all of the time. Some of the things that he has claimed about China could be true. Most of the things that he claims about China probably aren't. So when talking about this, we really have to take every single thing that he says or claims with a grain of salt. And honestly, none of us should be listening to him at all and just bypass him entirely and look at the real sources for where he's getting this information. And then we have, of course, Falun Gong, which has produced a ton of evidence against the Chinese government as well, which you have to take all of that with a grain of salt because it turns out that Falun Gong also is the creators of the Epoch Times, or the Epic Times, however you like to call it. And I would talk a whole lot more about Falun Gong and its relationship to this whole ordeal, but it's way too complicated to get into in this video. It would take an hour-long video all on its own. And in fact, there are a few videos that are really good about Falun Gong and its relationship to the Chinese government, linked down below. So then that brings us to the China cables, which were a bunch of leaked documents that were released somewhere around 2017, and I believe were fully evaluated and released to the public by 2019. And those documents basically outline a lot of the different techniques that are used within the detainment centers, or concentration camps, or re-education centers, or vocational schools, or whatever anybody is calling these things. It also shows how Uyghur Muslims are indiscriminately profiled and essentially locked up for no more than wearing beards or certain types of clothing, and anything that they consider suspicious behavior can be basically used as a charge of potential terrorism, and a lot of these people will end up getting locked up as well. As far as forced sterilization centers, mass executions, and torture is concerned, I haven't personally seen any documentation that 100% proves conclusively that there are those things happening. But considering most other governments, including my own, the Canadian government, and the American government, have been doing that sort of thing to its own people for generations, so it wouldn't surprise me that it was also happening in China as well. And of course in Canada, I'm referring to the active genocide that's going on with the Native American population right now, where they have been forced sterilizing a lot of the Native people and putting them into essentially re-education camp schools called residential schools, and this was happening all the way up until at least the 1990s, and even today a lot of those same atrocities are going down, not to mention the multiple genocides that are going on in the United States right now, specifically their own genocide of their Native American population, the genocide that's going on of the Mexican population at the border, and of course the ongoing genocide that has been happening to the African American population, and even the intent to do this specifically to the African American population and communists was admitted to by John Elshman, Nixon's aide on domestic affairs, who said, "The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and the blacks with heroin, and then criminalize both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." And again, that was according to John Elshman, Nixon's aide on domestic affairs. Now, obviously, the China cables have been resoundingly denounced as fake news by everyone in the Chinese government. But it was released by a fairly reputable source, and it seems that most of the information in it is fairly accurate.
My name is Richard Bilton. I'm a reporter for BBC Panorama. I wrote to you this week, sir, actually, about the camps in Xinjiang. I know that they are prison camps. Why won't you tell me the truth about those camps?
First of all, I would say there's no so-called labor camps, as you described. There's what we call vocational education and training centers. They are there for the prevention of a terrorist.
With respect, sir, I have seen, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I have seen the orders that are sent to the prison camps, and they are prisons.
What order you have? You mean the order said this is a prison camps?
They are orders for the people who run the camps, and they're quite clear that this is a prison camp.
This is a pure
Sir,
fabrication.
It's true, and they're brainwashing
what
camps.
What is happening?
They change the way people behave, what they believe, even the language they speak. So they are brainwashing camps, aren't they?
I think there's no such order for prison camps. You know, in Xinjiang, religious freedom is fully respected.
Just to be clear, the documents I've seen make it quite clear that people are held there, Hundreds of thousands of people are held in these camps across Xinjiang. What you're telling me bears no relation to what I've seen.
The document, so-called document you're talking about, is a pure fabrications. Don't listen to fake news. Don't listen to fabrications.
Contrasting that with the laws that the Chinese government has even admitted to having against Uyghur Muslims, it would seem that the evidence on this specific incident is fairly damning. And to make matters worse, there has actually been a documented history of essentially a type of Sinification, I think that's the right word, going all across the entirety of China, and a lot of the places that China has control over. Essentially that means that they're trying to, more or less, push their culture on all of the other cultures that are around them. Now, they have reason that they say that they're doing this, such as teaching Muslims and people that speak different languages, specifically Chinese languages, because they would be more able to get jobs in Chinese companies if they do that sort of thing. But many people have argued that this is essentially a way of erasing these people's history. And it's not dissimilar to what the Canadian government has been doing for many, many years to the indigenous population here, where they essentially were eradicating the native languages of many of the native populations, which was incredibly detrimental because most of those languages come from a spoken tradition. To know more about that and some of the laws that the Chinese government has specifically made against the Uyghur people, check out another link in the description box below to a Surfs video. Now, as far as the number of people that are being detained and put into these camps, they're all over the place, and all of them are disputed by different sides, saying that each side is getting the number totally wrong. The numbers range anywhere from below 1 million to 1.8 million. I think some figures even said that it was more than 2 million, and as far as I've seen, I haven't actually been able to find any hard numbers on that. If you have some, again, leave them down below in the comment section. So now, looking at this dialectically, we've looked at the American narrative, we've looked at the Chinese narrative, and we've tried to look at a few historical events and so forth that basically paint a picture of what is going on within China. Now, I guess we're gonna have to cover the topic of what is really going on here. So obviously, a lot of the sources are really mixed, but some of them are more credible than others. And some of the stories do overlap to paint a broader picture. And even though most of this information is highly propagandized, one bit of information really pops out as being something that is at least not completely refuted at this point, and that's the China cables. No sources that I have read sufficiently address the invalidity of those claims, and until I see some evidence against them, it seems like it makes a whole lot of sense, especially given the history of China and the Uyghur people. The Uyghur population in Xinjiang has, and has for a very long time, had a very large separatist movement that wants to essentially take the majority of Xinjiang and make it into its own country. I believe they want to call it East Turkestan. And the Chinese government is so against this idea that I believe in some places it's even being made basically illegal to mention the name East Turkestan. But this separatist movement has existed all the way back from before World War II. In fact, the Soviets used this separatist movement as essentially one of the armies that they were using in that area to fight against the Kuomintang in China during World War II. And it wasn't until Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists ended up taking over most of China that really the Uyghurs were able to fully integrate into Chinese society.
I think for 40 years it did sort of work. If you worked hard in the Chinese system, you could get along well as a Uyghur or as a Hui, or as a Muslim, or as a Tibetan even. But now that's breaking down for various reasons. And what we see as a result is a huge upsurge in violence related to the Uyghurs and the Xinjiang problem. We were predicting that in the early 2000s, but we were hoping that China would sort of revise some of its policies.
At that point, the Uyghur Muslims were essentially working with the Soviet Union communists and therefore allying themselves with the other communist nation that was just forming, known as the People's Republic of China. Back in those days, they were sort of working together. So in those days, there was almost like a unification. But like I said, it would seem that China has a bit of a racism problem when it comes to Arabs. And most of the Uyghur Muslims that are there aren't really looked at as being equal to the Han Chinese. It's like I just went into puberty there. The Han Chinese people don't see them as being as civilized. They see them as being behind the rest of China. And they treat them very differently. Those riots that ended up happening back in 2009, the majority of those riots were happening because a lot of the Uyghur people felt like they were being treated unfairly in the workforce. They didn't think that they were getting an equal share of the amount that they were producing, and therefore, just like any population that feels as though they are getting shafted, they rose up. But just like in the Nationalist Republic of China, the new Communist People's Republic of China looked at Xinjiang. They look at Xinjiang as being a resource-rich, important area for them to hold on to. So even though the separatists want to have their own country, their own Islamic nation, they can't really get that because China recognizes how important that area is geopolitically.
But clearly for this issue, the western region of China is critical. Not only does it have to go outside of its borders to garner resource all the way to the Middle East. This is what this Iron Belt Silk Road is to get rail lines. It already has pipelines to the Caspian Sea region. But also it has to go through this region known as Xinjiang. So suddenly that region has become what Owen Lattimore called the pivot of Asia. And it's pivotal not only because of its resources, which are greatly diminished, but also because of its access to external resources.
And it happens to have a group of people that they already deem as not being necessarily equal to the rest of them. So cheap labor. A story that we've heard again and again and again from places like the United States and Europe, Canada, and essentially every other country that uses either a capitalist or a mixed market economy. They all tend to find some group that they can exploit for their labor and essentially work to death so a smaller group can profit. So now we've looked at a lot of different sides of all of this. Can we conclusively say that it is, in fact, a genocide? Well, like I said at the beginning, I personally think that it is. But that is my own personal opinion. Let's look at what other people have said about it. So who is saying that it's 100% absolutely, unequivocally a genocide? Well, we have Adrian Zens, who we talked about earlier, and we don't need to discuss here. We have Marsha Blackburn, who is a member of the United States Congress that said these things. Yeah, those are some interesting tweets.
That sounds a lot like Communist China to me. China would prefer Joe Biden to combat what the Chinese Communist regime unleashed on the world.
The US government and the State Department have come out and said that it is essentially a cultural genocide, and the Canadian government also made a non-binding motion stating that it is also a genocide, though the entirety of the Canadian government didn't say that, but we'll talk about that in 1 second. And let's not forget that a lot of people that are claiming that this is 100% unequivocally a genocide is a lot of conservative pundits who want to make China look bad for political reasons. Now, that isn't to say that it isn't a cultural genocide, but a lot of those Republicans and conservatives are trying to make it seem as though this is the worst possible atrocity on the face of the earth, like it's 100,000 times worse than the Holocaust. It's in fact 1,000 Holocausts, 1,000,000 Holocausts, when it is in fact bad, but saying that it's equivalent to the Holocaust is essentially a Red Scare. It's just something that people are doing to essentially fearmonger and, yes, red bait or McCarthy scare everyone into thinking that communist China is worse than Hitler's Germany, when the fact is that China is an oppressive, authoritarian state that also sometimes does some good stuff. The standard of living for the average Chinese person has gone up exponentially. Their health and wellness and happiness has all increased. But that doesn't mean that it isn't an authoritarian hellscape. It's exactly the same as the United States. The powers that control all of these different authoritarian regimes are essentially using the same tactics to oppress their own people. And they've been doing this for decades. Now that I've done that rant, who's saying that it's not a genocide? Well, Justin Trudeau and most of his cabinet for one. Yes, the Canadian government sort of said that it was a genocide in, again, a non-binding motion, but the Trudeau government, or specifically Justin Trudeau and his cabinet minus one person, all claim that saying that it's a genocide is basically using extremely loaded language. In the United Kingdom, even though certain legal analysts have claimed that this is a genocide, the government themselves hasn't really said much about it. And apparently even Boris Johnson deflected an appeal to match the US's declaration of a genocide, saying that it remains just a judicial matter. So even according to all Western sources, only 2 countries have really stated that it is actually a genocide. One of them only tepidly, the other one, the United States government, basically fully, I guess. While essentially every other nation across the world doesn't say that it's actually a genocide. Though, over 20 countries do agree that this is some kind of human rights abuse or possibly crimes against humanity. But according to several sources, some of them being Chinese, there is over 50 countries who essentially say that the Chinese government's stance on this entire issue, including their re-education camps and all of that sort of thing, all of that treatment is apparently A-OK. And it's important to note that most of the countries that are saying that are primarily Muslim countries.
Yes, 22 Western countries and Japan wrote a letter to the UN criticizing China's Xinjiang camps, but 54 countries, most of them Muslim-majority states, defended China's counter-extremism efforts in Xinjiang, commending China in its development policies there and in quote-unquote promoting care to its Muslim citizens.
Now, you could always ask the question, do these Muslim countries have some sort of fealty for China? Do they profit in some way by giving China a pass on all of these human rights abuses? Yeah, probably. Actually, definitely. I would say that through things like the Belt and Road Initiative, yeah, a lot of these countries are benefiting from China in many different ways. But the countries that are saying that it is a genocide are countries that are primary trade partners with the United States. But it's pretty interesting to think about that the only people that are actually claiming that this is a genocide, honestly, without being total hypocrites, are people that are fully anti-state. People that are saying, yes, this is a genocide, but also all of the atrocities that happen in America and Canada and in Europe and Scandinavia and all across the Middle East, and that all of those are also genocides. We have to be intellectually honest about this, and if we're going to classify what China is doing as a genocide, we have to also say that everywhere else is doing a genocide too. And that's where all of these other countries and politicians and media outlets, that's where they stop short, because they have a financial incentive to say that China is the only one committing a genocide, while they get to stand on their high horse and say, we're so perfect, we are not, when they clearly are. But it wasn't always like that. It wasn't always the West against China. For a long time, actually, China and the West, were working together. Remember back when I was talking about 9/11? Now, according to experts on the matter, and not Adrian Zenz, but actual experts, specifically an opinion by Drew C. Gladney, recent president of the Pacific Basin Institute at Poma College, and is currently a professor of anthropology there. Gladney is author of 4 books and more than 100 academic articles and book chapters on topics spanning the Asian continent. He received his PhD in social anthropology from the University of Washington, Seattle in 1987, and Gladney focuses his research on ethnic and cultural nationalism in Asia, specializing in the peoples, politics, and cultures of the Silk Road and Muslim Chinese. And this expert actually has come out and said that a lot of what was going on back in those days was essentially a quid pro quo between the Chinese government and the American one. And if I'm to read into that personally, that says to me that essentially they were in cahoots. They were working together.
The Uyghurs have been accused of being terrorists. This violence is increasing. We have seen terrorism orchestrated by Uyghurs. But I think to some extent this earlier analysis by Oxford Analytica, drawing on some of our work, is still true in the sense that many of them were made scapegoats for wider problems in Chinese society that we had tried to identify. In fact, in 2001, just 10 days before 9/11, the Chinese government itself said there was no terrorism in Xinjiang. Suddenly 9/11 happens. We need China's cooperation to move into Afghanistan and Iraq, and the Chinese agreed to not speak out against this or to work against this to allow us to do that. In turn, we agreed to support them in their crackdown on the Uyghurs, and that led to the arrest of the Uyghurs in Guantanamo Bay. This sort of anti-terrorism cooperation.
Now you're probably wondering what exactly I'm talking about. And I'm talking about the invasion in Afghanistan. You see, the United States needed somebody to basically have their back down there. And Afghanistan borders Xinjiang. Afghanistan and Xinjiang border each other. They're right next to one another. And also it just happens that Afghanistan is geopolitically right in the middle of a bunch of very important other places where they can extract resources and minerals and all sorts of things and send them straight through, essentially bringing them to Europe and the rest of the world. China, as well, has geopolitical interests in that area. Like I said before, the area of Xinjiang is resource-rich. Xinjiang! Not only is Xinjiang full of resources, but it's also the direct pathway for China's Belt and Road Initiative. You know, the one that we were talking about before. Essentially, China is creating a trade route through that area so they can work with a bunch of other countries all across Eurasia, creating a massive market, a massive influx of income for the Chinese state. But there were problems. Obviously, in Afghanistan, there were a lot of people that didn't just want to give up all of their land. And in Xinjiang, there were a lot of people that wanted their own nation, and they wanted to be left alone from China. They wanted to basically have autonomy for their own country. And that was the Uyghur people. So, if the United States was able to essentially say that there were terrorist groups popping up in Afghanistan and Xinjiang and all of that, at the same time as China was able to say that there were Muslim terrorist cells popping up in the Uyghur population and also in Afghanistan and so forth, then they could essentially work with one another, so they could essentially suppress the peoples in those areas and kill them, rob them, and extort them for their labor. That's the game. That's the old game, you know? And they just went in and raped the land, stole all the resources, and started moving a bunch of their own people into that property, onto that land, using the farms that the Uyghur people once used for hundreds of years for their own population. This Sinification is not dissimilar to things that the Soviet Union was doing to a lot of the other satellite countries that it controlled as well. For instance, for a very long time during the Soviet Union, the Ukrainian people started to lose their native language, and they all started being taught Russian, so they could work in Russian businesses and be a part of the Russian government and blah, 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 blah. Very similar to what's going on here. Back in those days, it was called, I believe, Russification. And this isn't a good thing. This is a very weird thing that authoritarian socialist countries do. And I am not a fan. Not at all. Now, over time, China started to become a world superpower. It started to gain more and more wealth, and started to raise the standard of living of its people, and started to actually become a real threat to the United States' hegemony over the entire world. So the United States now is really pushing back. That's why we see things like the incredible ramp up of United States military troops just kind of hanging out right near China, specifically in the South China Sea and Taiwan. That's why there have been so many verbal attacks from the former president and a lot of other officials in the American, Canadian, and European governments. That's why you see a lot of American battleships and all of that doing routine training missions just off the coast, always basically presenting an aggressive behavior. That's why we've seen the incredible uptick in Chinese racism in regards to the coronavirus, constantly giving this narrative that it's the China virus and cutesy little slogans like the Wuhan flu. All of this works towards anti-Chinese rhetoric, racism, and xenophobia. Oh, and let's not even forget that Canada already pulled some shit off like this before when they imprisoned the Huawei executives. You know, the guys that were essentially in charge of the Chinese iPhone company, you know, how they imprisoned them because they were doing better than the Americans, I guess? I don't fucking know. And yeah, that doesn't mean that what China is doing isn't real and true. It absolutely is. But it also means that the United States and every other country is using this for their advantage. And let's not forget that the immediate effect of calling out this specific thing as a genocide, again, let's talk about the South China Sea and Taiwan, those places are going to be totally fucked, and we could be looking at a legit nuclear war if we actually involve ourselves in a real hot battle on those fronts. But of course the genocide is happening, and the United States government is using the immediate genocide to deflect against things that are happening here at home. Like Joe Biden's own personal genocide, where an incredible uptick of the number of children that are being detained at the border has increased because he changed the rules around. According to Title 42, if an entire family shows up, a father, mother, and children, then they will be turned away. But if they show up alone, the children, with either a guardian or a grandfather or grandparent, they'll be separated, but they'll at least be able to get across the border. And then they get detained, which results in an increase of detainment of children at the border, while at the same time the Biden administration gets to say, oh, it's no big deal because we actually aren't separating the families now, even though they're just not separating the families directly, they're doing it indirectly. And I want to really express the consequences of all of this, because what is essentially happening is a new Red Scare. I've discovered firsthand that if you even go around expressing a hint of skepticism on any of this, you are immediately classified as a genocide denier, exactly the same, no better than a fucking neo-Nazi. And that narrative isn't just being pushed by the right, it's being pushed by a lot of the left as well. Very large name leftist streamers have gone on tirades basically declaring half of the entire left as essentially being nothing more than genocide denial red fash. Anyway, that's not something that we even need to touch on. The truth is that this is being used by the American government to smear China, to ramp up tensions, to create a new Cold War, a new Red Scare, a new McCarthyism, and essentially try to destroy the communist country of China and all leftist dissent here at home. So is there a genocide happening in Xinjiang? I personally believe, yes, there is a cultural genocide. But again, I'm going to ask every one of you to go and look at the research yourselves. Think for yourselves and don't take anyone's opinion on the matter, especially if you haven't researched it and looked into it independently. You can't just take the word of some guy that tells you things online and expect it to be true or real or gospel. You have to kill your heroes. You have to not idolize these people and think that their word is the word of God. At least that's the way I look at it. For the love of God, please be kind to one another in the comment section. Thanks for watching.